Do you remember that cliff where you first saw me in Monte Carlo? Well, I went there with Rebecca on our honeymoon. That was when I found out about her. 4 days after we were married. She stood there laughing, her black hair blowing in the wind, and told me all about herself.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by David Hamilton Nichols, who is a speaker, author, impact investor, and producer. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so let's start with your family legacy. Tell us about how they got started in their respective family business over the years.
Well, my family, from I'm fourth generation, a Southern California farming family. My great-grandfather came to this area before the turn of 1900. And as far as California goes, that means you have been here a while. And so we've been in farming. I don't personally do that day to day, but my dad was still even developing some farmland while he was alive. And so, I mean, obviously, I do have a tie with the environment through some of that, of course. And we've also been involved in real estate. So that is basically my family background, although I personally have ventured out into a lot of other things, apart from agriculture and real estate, into startups and into, as you mentioned, film production things as well.
All right, so we will have a chance to cover some of those other areas, but going back to kind of the genesis, can you talk about some of the different kinds of crops or agriculture that your family have been involved over the century, I guess, a century or so?
Currently, a lot of it is basically avocados and lemons. But back in the day, I mean, my grandfather was dealing with walnuts and other kinds of citrus like oranges. Things have changed depending on what the market is and land values and what is going to be grown in an area. So obviously things do change. But my grandfather was dealing with some of those things. I believe, if I recall, my great grandfather also did some walnuts back in the day, and so that's basically, it's changed a lot of what is grown in the area. We also did at some point some row crops, but not much that way.
So I think, what's really interesting about legacy family offices, of course, is the way they're kind of so tightly integrated to history of California, history of the United States. And I got to believe that there's some really major milestones, whether historic or specific to your farms.
Yeah, well, I know my
stories that have been passed down to you.
I would, from what I have heard, and I don't know the exact details on this, but what I always heard growing up was that my great-grandfather did a fair amount of work with Mulholland, who built a lot of the dams in California. And my grandfather was on the California State Water Commission appointed by Governor Reagan at the time. So, I mean, there definitely were some historical, crossovers and things. As far as land goes, we've seen a lot of, the history and how land use laws have changed, of course. I mean, everything from going through condemnation with the, eminent domain to also, seeing what was going on with, under Roosevelt with the Works Progress Administration and all of that. So there's, we did, experience a lot of different, pieces of history, obviously, that are tied in with how land is used.
Well, it's incredible. It really is. And of course, for anybody that's somewhat familiar with California, especially Southern California, water and land management is such a big issue. Can you give us a kind of a quick real-time update in terms of what's happening in terms of water in Southern California, in terms of the source coming from the Sierras?
Well, my understanding is that the snowpacks aren't what they used to be in the Sierras, and a lot of, we've also seen, water-wise, it's becoming more and more of an issue, between where does water go, and where does it go, to the population, or does it go to the people who are feeding the population, namely the farmers? And that, of course, I mean, that's always, water has always been a historical thing. Wars have been fought over waters, and maybe someday, if we don't handle things right, wars could be fought again over water again. But we see also a lot more going on with a lot of farmers are still use well water if they aren't on the getting from a water company. And, there's we've seen a lot of depletion of aquifers going on as well.
Yeah, actually, you hit up on a great topic, which hopefully we'll elaborate a little bit further when we talk about sustainability and climate change. But, to your point is that because of water scarcity and even limitations on how much water that farmers can actually utilize, they're really tapping out the water tables. But at some point, it's just, it's not going to be, there's not going to be any supply there anymore. And then what happens? But going back to your family, I got to believe over the generations, there's been a lot of just really concrete family principles and values that's been passed down from generation to generation. Are you able to share a few?
Well, I would say the biggest values are integrity and hard work. My grandfather would, if he shook his hand on something, it was as good as done. And I generally lived by that. And my grandfather knew as well that there were some things you had, hold people accountable in writing, of course, because, not everybody's going to be scrupulous. And of course, now more and more things don't work quite that way as much. But the fact of holding to one's word and honoring that, and it's like, if you say it and shake your hand on it, it's as good as done. That is a value that has definitely been passed down. Another one, as I said, is the hard work and diligence, and just also valuing the land and just the beauty of the land. Like if I go out and walking in nature, I can feel that from on a familial level.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on something that's really, I think, very relevant to many people. So even if they're not farmers per se, something about the land or something about being in the forest or just with nature, we value it. And of course, it does great things for our psyche or our health, physical health, but certainly the sustainability and overall composition of our society. I want to talk a little bit about some of these values that you're bringing out. And I think it's a really important thing that I don't think we talk about enough in the modern world, of very much a litigious world where people are, armed with their team of attorneys on both sides and contracts and agreements. This notion of integrity and shake on one's hands and to commit to that's a really hard thing to do. And actually, at the time of this taping, we have the COP26 climate summit that's happening. And this is a perfect example where you have world leaders at the highest level making commitments. But I wonder if they're going to really shake hands and stick by it, or they're going to do what they've done always in the past, which is, whether it's the Paris Climate Accord or anything else, just kind of backslide when it's convenient.
Politicians shake a lot of hands, let's put it that way. And a lot of those hands they shake have a lot of conflicting interests. So I would say, you will probably see some handshakes going on, but you will quite possibly not see certain elements of follow through. Mm-hmm. And that's unfortunate, but it's like, and if one is, my hand shake, don't say something unless you intend to do it.
Amazing. Well, this is actually kind of a nouveau concept these days. So
It's an old concept, but
no,
it has become a new concept. And as I say, I mean, even my grandfather realized it, that a lot of things you're going to have to put in writing. But if he said he was going to do something or be someplace to do something, it would happen. And now whether or not other people did or didn't, that was on them. But he was also, knew to get, was sharp and savvy enough to get people to put it in writing. And of course, we do, as you said, live in a somewhat different age now, and there needs to be even more and more in writing. But that basic principle of integrity is what we, at least I feel should come back to. And as I say, I'm not even in the day-to-day farming. That kind of ended with my father, although there are some cousins that are still doing it day-to-day, active, in the field agriculture. But that is not me personally.
Well, the other aspect that you talked about was this notion of hard work. And I think, especially in the context of climate change, I think sometimes we kind of forget that. And let me just kind of clarify what I mean by that is, I think certainly when it comes to activism, it's wonderful that we march and we show up and really show our spirit and enthusiasm for it. But at the same time, this notion of hard work, especially in the context of farming or agriculture, is that you really have to work at it from sun up to sundown. It isn't something that you show up once or twice a week on the field and then somehow magically at the end of the season you have this incredible yield in terms of crops. Same thing with climate change, especially where we are. It's going to take a ton of hard work, and I wonder, going back to the principles of farming, what are some things that we can take away in terms of how we should be looking at climate change from a hard work perspective? You may also like our quarterly Ask Perkins event that brings some of the most notable experts and category leading startups in their area of sustainability and human survival on Earth and in space. To register, visit asterperkins.com/events.
Well, from a hard work perspective, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that bit about the activists, because if you wanted, my grandfather had basically zero use for activists. I mean, since you're talking family here, I'll bring that up, because a lot of the time it's just a lot of talk, and there's not much. There was a lot of ideals without any pragmatism, and didn't get much done anyway. So, and that we do see some of that today. We need to come in a way where there is balance, and it requires work rather than talk, of course. And I find that a lot of businesses are going to be the prime, movers in a lot of this. Businesses that are dealing with climate, because that hard work element is involved. And ideas are great. The fact that there are people bringing awareness is great. I don't want to come off too hard on those who are doing activism. That is valuable. But, really where it comes down, what are those structures that have the ability to implement a massive change and scale that? That is a business. It's not necessarily, just going out and protesting, which it does have its place, of course.
Yep, absolutely. Makes plenty of sense.
So the work in my family, it transitioned in some ways from agriculture to a number of other kind of businesses over, the generations as well. So that is, that work ethic, can translate into any type of business. It's just, you see it, as you mentioned, you're not going to have some crop at the end of a season if you haven't put in the work. Mm-hmm. It may be in some, businesses like with media and stuff, you can spin stuff a little better, and you might be able to hide stuff. But, in the end, as you sow, so you shall reap. To go back to the basics, and it may just be a little easier to hide, but it's obviously right in your face if you're in agriculture.
Mm-hmm. So when we think about sources of pollutants, whether CO2, methane, and whatnot, there are certain kind of obvious places, and most people think of oil and gas, transportation, but agriculture perhaps maybe isn't really as well known for the mainstream. Can you help us understand, both from the harmful side in terms of use of pesticides as well as chemical fertilizers, but also the positive, this other spectrum of regenerative farming and how we can actually use farming to help fight climate change.
We have, if you look back, we've had a lot of development of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, and at the time, people thought this was a great thing, and yes, in some ways, it did increase yields and profits, which of course is good. But the damage, in some ways, that has been done by those, we have seen degradation of soil in a lot of places. We have seen toxicity in our just environment in general, and the runoff that goes down our rivers and into our oceans. It does take its toll.
Yeah, and really, and I think
so I would say some things that can be done. There's obviously I remember even my dad was using, like, sometimes would use beneficial insects instead of pesticides on some things when he could. There are kind of more organic ways of doing things. There are as far as enriching the soil, and this of course is good as far as carbon is concerned. Having like cover crops. Things like that. You could, just like for example, you might have like vacant soil, like in your rows if you're growing trees, and you can put a cover crop in there. There's various ways, but regenerative agriculture, that's something that a lot of people are getting into more and more, and we'll see more as that progresses. But there's definitely some real promise there.
So for those that are not as familiar with regenerative farming, can you define what that means?
I am not, as I said, I don't farm day to day, and I am not, super versed in that particular movement. But here's how I see it: is basically they're taking practices that are more sustainable, and and hopefully, and it gets carbon back stored into the soil. And that carbon, when it's in the soil is richer. And you get more productive. A big issue in growing any food is the soil quality, and if you can you get carbon out of the atmosphere and you have it stored in the soil, and that's enriching the soil, it is regenerative overall.
Yeah, and I think you hit up on another area, which is the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides over the years. And in many ways, we've actually started to really introduce, like you said, a lot of toxin, but also there's some natural kind of balance in the soil that, let's call it God-given capabilities that we've essentially kind of suppressed. So in other words, there are actually bacteria or microbiomes that are in the soil that naturally generate food sources for these crops that we effectively essentially killed off or suppressed over like a century.
It's like with,
please go ahead.
It's like with an antibiotic, right? Antibiotics have, been in a lot of ways have been a boon to, human life on this planet, because when things that would have killed somebody, likely their lives are saved. But with the excessive use of those, and we have seen things become resistant. But more aptly for this conversation, you look at the biome in the gut, that the good is killed along with the bad with a lot of the antibiotics, and that is something that is a healthy thing to have in the gut. And if can't replenish that, there are some effects from that. It's a similar thing with the soil, like you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to kind of transition to talk a little bit about, so again, now that we have a good understanding of your generational background and your love and the support of the earth, the terra, is how you're then taking some of these, beliefs and practices and in your own way manifesting that into the world. And what are some of the endeavors that you're involved with?
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's where more of my expertise lies, is because I've been more involved with the real estate and then startups. So I am glad we transitioned to that. So thank you. I am in a number of startups, and a number of those are actually dealing with climate and renewable energy. I can give you some examples if you like of some of those. I mean, I think that's probably the best way to go. And that's one would be probably the first climate company I invested in is a Norwegian company called Choose. That's with 3 O's, CHOOOSE. And they offer digital tools for individuals and businesses to offset their carbon footprint. And they have partnered with a number of companies, of some airlines, which include Norwegian Airlines and which include Southwest Airlines recently. And some partner with Heathrow International Airport. So, I mean, definitely they're helping out with that, travel sector. I mean, obviously there are some things, that are going to have to be offset. I mean, it's a pronged approach dealing with climate issues because, those things, there are always, at least for the near future, they're going to be and middle term future, there are things that need offset. We can't just necessarily do everything from eliminating it, period. So they can offset those airline emissions. They've also partnered, with Santander Bank. I believe it's for their auto division, and recently just actually partnered with Shell. Shell is, doing a fair amount of things to go green in some way. So they partnered with Shell Ventures and received an investment from Shell. So they've done a lot of good work there. And I can really appreciate that. I'm actually their first American investor, and I'm also served as a strategic advisor for them.
Great. So not to belabor, but in terms of just for clarification on Choose, so is it the carbon offset market that they're involved in, or is it the carbon accounting that they're trying to help identify?
They can offset. They offset.
Mm-hmm.
And they can basically have a suite of digital tools like that can help the companies, or if it's simpler if it's individuals. Obviously, individuals don't need all that, but they can keep it simpler. But they give them an easy way to do that. If I recall, I think individuals they've done probably over individuals in over 70 countries, if I recall that number correctly.
Okay. All right. So let's move on to maybe one more example that you've invested in.
Another example would be Ether Diamonds, and they are a company that takes the carbon out of the atmosphere and makes diamonds out of that. Real world diamonds, that jewelry that you could put on a spouse's ring finger, and that's one of the most interesting things I've come across in a long time. They basically are the world's first carbon negative diamonds. You're not funding a conflict, or tearing up the earth with them, and they set their jewelry in fair mined gold. So that's obviously good for the earth. And this is this shocked me when I heard this, but they are actually got vegan certified, and I know that may sound strange, but here's why: because they are good for the earth, and they aren't damaging the environment and hurting the habitat of animals. So they actually became the world's first diamond to be vegan certified, and that's that blew my mind.
Now, I know that man-made diamond's been around for some time, and it's used pretty extensively in technology and, of course, components supporting semiconductors and robotics.
Correct.
So I wonder, how is their approach or solution different? And more importantly, what they're doing, is it really making a tangible difference because of the volume of carbon that they're working with? Don't forget to visit astroperkins.com to register for our next quarterly events. Past and current speakers include Damian Vaughn, former NFL player, Neil Gregory, Chief Thought Leadership Officer at the IFC World Bank, and many more. To register, visit astroperkins.com and click on Events.
They're taking carbon out of the atmosphere to do this. They have partnered with, I'm not going to say the name of it because I don't remember which of the two major companies it is that they have the carbon removal from the atmosphere. So I'm not going to say which one it is because I can't remember which of the two it is off the top of my head. But they have carbon that's out of the atmosphere, and they make that into the diamonds. And if I recall, I don't recall the exact figures, but it was a sizable amount, per diamond. That it was a sizable amount. So if somebody's buying it, they're offsetting a fair chunk of their carbon that they emit.
Well, we love to see them build buildings and cities, and hopefully make even a bigger footprint impact. Great.
Yeah, they're definitely and you add up, that there's multiple people and buy multiple jewelry. It does start to really add up.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you, why do you feel that sustainability can be one of the ways can be best achieved this through investment in startups?
Well, as I touched on earlier, businesses have a unique thing and that is the ability to scale. That a lot of 501c3s, bless them for all the great work they do, but they generally don't have that ability to scale in most cases that startup businesses do. And startups usually are somewhat inherently disruptive in what they're addressing quite frequently. So they lend themselves to dealing with an issue like climate change. That's those are the two biggest factors in how I see that. And really,
no, makes sense. Absolutely. Now, aside from investing in startups, you also mentioned real estate, and when we think about real estate, of course, they tend to be heavy consumers of electricity and other energy sources and utilities, of course, but also giving up quite a bit of carbon as well. So, how are you thinking through your real estate portfolio, but also the maintenance and the optimization of those assets?
Well, in a number of ways, because of the rentals and things that I do deal in commercial, they're already built. There's not quite as many ways to deal with it as if they were, if we were talking new construction. But I'd prefer to answer this, from a new construction perspective. And of course, there are ways you can, add renewable, energy or solar on your property if that makes sense. But I would say going forward, there are definitely a lot of things like if you're, people are now dealing with, talking about concrete that can potentially, could store carbon. There, of course, any new development should be have energy efficiency, and those certifications in mind, and potentially have a solar installed on it. Those are some examples. I haven't, done as much in the real estate field regarding sustainability because, as I mentioned, I'm dealing with mostly things that have already been built. I am not a developer personally, but I could see there are some ways that could be handled.
And we've had people on this podcast before that are in the real estate market, including private equities and large real estate developers and those that actually manage those properties as well. And it's always kind of a challenging discussion because, if you are holding, a portfolio of real estate, it's all about cash flow and certain sets of ratios, right? So Correct. You want to be thoughtful about how you spend your CapEx, especially
exactly.
if it's an older, building, let's say. But I wonder if there are some easy ways, low-cost ways to, optimize and to reduce that footprint, and whether it's in the water usage or even, there are technologies and solutions that are out there that are actually reusing some of the heat from the sewage, for example, to heat up the building, for instance, or the differential between the temperature under the ground versus above the ground to reduce the energy consumption in terms of heat, for example, during the winter, for instance. So there's a lot of innovation that's happening. But I wonder if, practical sense, what do you think would be realistic and would be viable for other real estate holders to consider?
I would say one thing that is, things that are low cost, simple solutions are often sometimes the best. And here's one that comes to mind. It's those low flow filters on, for sinks and, and then low flow toilets and all of those things. Those are, simple solutions that don't, put a big dent in the cash, as you said. So, I mean, things like that are things that are more likely to get adopted in the middle term when there's not some major improvement going on or an actual new development. I see where a lot more of this tends to happen is, when there's either some major renovation or when there is or a new development is where a lot of the more capital intensive things come into play. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I just threw that other out as an example on the low flow, but that is, simple. There's, motivation there, for that kind of thing.
Yep, makes sense. Absolutely. Now, I know we've been talking about primarily sustainability, but I want to change the conversation a little bit towards movement of people as well as trends that perhaps may be semi-permanent or may become quasi-permanent. And certainly during the pandemic, we've seen quite a bit of flight from the bigger city centers to really all over as people become somewhat nomadic and can actually work remotely and via Zoom and so forth. So I wonder what that means for not only for your portfolio, but also just other real estate holders as they're holding everything from commercial things with tenancy, or maybe things that's more office space or multi-mix, multi-use, for example, and how they need to think about city centers, suburbs, and other locales in relation to some of these trends that could stick around.
Well, I would say one thing is you're going to see, and we have seen some of this as people move to more rural areas where there is actually in some ways a very good lifestyle. I mean, I think that's something people haven't really thought about sometimes, but the rural areas have a lot more of that natural beauty we were talking about and have that space where people aren't not so cramped together. So there are some definite benefits there. And as some of this happens, there are going to be, increase in real estate values in those locales. And that's, good for landholders, for people that maybe, live in the area and might be looking to buy. I mean, I want to be, conscious of the fact that it's going to make it a little harder on them. So, I mean, there is, there's pros and cons, involved in all of it. I do think as well, something to be mindful of in those communities is you're going to see perhaps people of a very, different mindset than some of these rural areas are used to moving in. So in a way that can, be a good thing and a bad thing, it's just how it parses out. So, I mean, I think there are some social factors that, need to be considered and thought about and how those are going to be dealt with. But as far as, market goes, that's it raises the value in those areas with that demand. I do believe the remote work, we will probably be seeing a continuation of that after the pandemic. I think some people will want to definitely go back to the office, and we've seen some of that already. Others would be just as happy, if they could live in a totally different area. So that I think we've covered that, or was there some other aspect of your question?
Yeah, no, I think because real estate is so diverse, I think there is different strategies that people are employing. So those that are holding, let's say, more retail-oriented types of holdings are going to be very different, facing different set of issues than, let's say, more office space versus more
correct
rental properties, for example.
Correct.
And specifically,
office is going to be office space. It potentially will weaken if a lot of this does end up occurring, and people really decide to move a lot to the more rural areas. The office space in the cities would definitely see a weakening in the market. Also, retail, I don't necessarily see that being as hard hit by that, but it obviously, if there are fewer shoppers, you could see, some element of that. But there's a lot of, population in the cities that does not work. That, like, whether they could be older and retired, they could be and maybe already, working at home. So I don't see it hitting quite as hard as, say, the office space. Now, commercial, industrial, that's a different breed of cat also.
Mhm. Well, of course, I think something that everyone just about talks about is during lockdown, effectively, we've seen a dramatic drop in carbon emissions. And a lot of that is
Correct.
just lack of traffic and congestion and people activities in big city centers.
Yes.
So definitely real estate and agriculture. I mean, these are two very distinct but very important verticals that contribute but also have the potentially the biggest positive impact to sustainability with the right approaches and optimization. Any other comments there before we move on to your book?
I would say that I think we'll see some shifts in the market, but I don't see this as insurmountable. We've seen shifts in a lot of ways before, and those who are smart are going to pay attention to those shifts, and those who aren't smart aren't going to pay attention. So I don't think it's anything that is insurmountable, but although we will probably see some shifts.
So let's talk about your upcoming book. Tell us a little bit about that and how that ties into your overall sustainability theme.
Okay, I'm currently working on a book called Mastering the Madness, Live Your Best Life and Create a Better World. And it deals with how we as individuals live our lives does have a major impact on the world. We can't get our own lives together. All this craziness that we see happening in the world. I mean, nobody can deny there's some pretty wild stuff happening these days. And if in a lot of that is the first step is don't be part of the problem. And once you're not part of the problem, what can you, as an individual do to be part of the solution? So, I mean, I look at it from how the individual, works with the collective, and it's basically, you could say it's a bit of a self-help book, with a focus on how we are impacting the world and, just general trends at large.
Now, again, if you could go into a little bit more depth or some key nuggets, but I think the area that I'm most interested in is I think human nature is the kind where we're not very good at taking advice, including self-advice. We don't necessarily take action or change behavior because it's good. We do it because it's convenient, because it's more accessible, because it's just something that we enjoy. Frankly, that includes our food and lifestyle. We choose to eat certain things not because it's necessarily good for the environment, but because it tastes better. So how do we get over some of these kind of human psyches?
A big part of that is that we, if we're engaging in less drama and less, problems in our own daily lives, we're living happier lives. We feel better. I mean, that's human nature too. So that's, kind of the perspective I come from when I look at that. It's like, what is that? I mean, who likes to be, fighting and squabbling all the time over every little thing, and we see, unfortunately, a lot of that, going on right now in the world. And, if we can, decrease some of that, we feel better. There is, a big incentive, for a human being for their overall happiness to decrease on some of those things and do things that are, positive and health affirming.
Now, of course, we've seen everyone from major publication reporters to independent journalists that have unplugged, that have chosen to live in a rural area and complete disconnect from the internet and social media, and don't even know what's really happening from the media, let alone having to engage in the drama that you refer to on social media. And
I'm
it's
not just
amazing.
talking social media, but a lot of you see it. But of course,
Right.
it is. I think social media is magnifying and then also feeding back into daily life that a lot of people experience. I mean, a lot of times, I would say people are not that or is even that functional in their daily lives. So if that's intensified and then put back into the feedback loop through social media. But I could see 100% why a lot of people love moving to rural areas and unplugging. It's a lot more peaceful.
But you're talking about something really, I think, deeper, right? I think it's almost like spirituality.
Correct. Yes. I have a background. I spoke in the personal development and spiritual field for a number of years in the past.
Yeah,
and I bring some of that to the world problems, and and seeing how the individual is involved in those.
So regardless of one's belief, I mean, it's this notion that you're anchored. There's a certain anchoring that helps you to think more in a calm, rational state versus
Correct.
constantly oscillating and the mind, at speeding at 100 miles an hour, trying to reconcile all these things that's happening all at the same time. So can you give some kind of practical thoughts around, again, coming from the book, whether it's around meditation or thought process that the audience can benefit from?
Well, I'll just say not necessarily things from the book, but just a few basic things in that regard would be take a breath before you speak. A lot of times we see people reacting. There's a lot of reactivity going on in life and social media. Just take a breath and think, what do I want to say here? Do I really want to be doing this? Or is there a better way? And that breath gives people a moment for pause. It gives and also it calms the nervous system. And then, somebody can maybe make a different decision than they might have made otherwise. Of course, meditation is definitely a good one. It makes one more centered overall. So those are a couple of things, that I think are useful.
Well, I think just kind of coming back full circle to our earlier conversation is that, I myself, for example, have a small little garden, about six raised garden boxes that have a variety of different vegetables and crops. And it's a pretty substantial yield, and we're able to supplement it with, whole foods and so forth. But it's very enjoyable to, grow things and to receive the benefit from it. And again, working the land, so to speak. But even for those that don't have necessarily that land, they can do so much by having some indoor plants. And it's so amazing how
definitely
when we're connecting with nature, taking walks at the park or in the forest, and just getting back to the basics, and it just does such great things and quiets the mind and gets rid of the drama so we can focus on what's important.
That is definitely a good one. I think if people spent more time in nature, they would probably be a lot more harmonious.
So on that note, I have been joined by David Hamilton Nichols, a speaker, author, impact investor, and producer. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.